There is a moment most people never talk about. It is not the moment of failure. It is not the moment of loss. It is the moment you wake up and realize you don't feel like yourself anymore. You have goals, you have plans, you know what you're capable of. But somehow the energy is gone. The fire that once pushed you forward feels quiet, almost distant. And the worst part is not that you stopped moving, it's that you still care, but you can't seem to act. And in that space, something dangerous starts happening. You begin to question yourself. You start calling it laziness. You start calling it weakness. But deep down, you know it is something else. Because even when you try to push forward, it feels like you are dragging your own mind through resistance you cannot explain. Now, here is the truth most people never hear clearly enough to change their life. You are not lacking motivation because you are broken. You are lacking motivation because you have been waiting for it. Waiting for a feeling to return. Waiting for the right moment. Waiting for energy to show up before you move. But life does not respond to waiting. Life responds to movement, and while you are waiting, time is still moving. Opportunities are still passing. Other people are still building, not because they always feel ready, but because they decided they would no longer depend on feeling ready. So the real question is not, where did your motivation go? The real question is, what are you going to do when it is not there? Because this is the exact moment where most people quit quietly, not with failure, not with a breakdown, but with delay, with excuses that feel reasonable, with promises they keep pushing into tomorrow. But if you stay with this message, you are going to understand something that changes everything about how you operate when you feel stuck. Motivation is often misunderstood as a spark that arrives first, something people wait for before they begin anything meaningful. But in reality, it is the opposite of that belief. Motivation is not the cause of action, it is the consequence of it. When a person sits still, thinking and waiting for a powerful emotional shift to push them forward, the mind slowly begins to justify inaction, and the longer they wait, the heavier the resistance becomes. But the moment action begins, even in its smallest form, something changes internally that cannot be explained by feeling alone. It is as if the mind wakes up only after the body decides to move. This is why so many people feel stuck, not because they lack potential, but because they are trying to think their way into a state that can only be created through doing. Action creates evidence, and evidence creates belief, and belief is what most people mistake for motivation. When you take even a simple step, writing one sentence, making one call, walking for 5 minutes, organizing a single part of your space, you interrupt the cycle of mental stagnation. That interruption is powerful because it signals to your subconscious that you are no longer negotiating with hesitation. And in that moment, energy begins to flow differently. The body starts to respond to movement, and the mind follows what the body consistently repeats. Waiting for motivation before action is like waiting for fire before striking a match. The spark only appears because friction is applied, not because heat already exists. Many lives remain unchanged because they are built on emotional dependency rather than behavioral initiation. They wait to feel ready, to feel confident, to feel inspired. But readiness is not a feeling, it is a byproduct of repetition. Confidence does not appear in silence, it is built in motion. Even failure within action produces more momentum than perfection within hesitation, because failure at least teaches direction while still keeping you engaged in the process of growth. The truth that separates those who rise from those who remain stagnant is simple. They do not ask whether they feel motivated, they ask what can be done right now with what they already have. And once that question becomes a habit, the mind begins to rewire itself, associating progress with movement instead of emotion. And slowly the illusion of waiting for motivation disappears as the life built through consistent action begins to take shape in ways that were never visible while sitting still. The environment a person lives in is not just a background to their life. It is an active force shaping their thoughts, emotions, decisions, and ultimately their direction. When motivation feels absent, most people search internally, trying to fix something within their mindset, but they often ignore the fact that their surroundings are constantly influencing that mindset without permission. Every sound, every conversation, every image on a screen, every habit in the space they occupy is either strengthening their discipline or quietly draining it. A cluttered environment does not just create physical disorganization, it creates mental noise that makes clarity harder to access. Likewise, a negative or aimless social circle does not simply pass time with you, it gradually normalizes low standards, excuses, and delayed action until those patterns feel comfortable. In such an environment, even strong intentions begin to weaken because repetition of influence is more powerful than isolated moments of inspiration. This is why a person can feel highly motivated after a video, a speech, or a moment of reflection, but within hours return to the same inactive state because their environment has not changed to support that motivation. The mind is highly adaptive, and it always adjusts to what is most consistently around it. If it is surrounded by distraction, it becomes distracted. If it is surrounded by discipline, it begins to align with discipline. This means motivation is not only an internal battle, but also an external design issue. Even the content consumed daily plays a silent but powerful role, because what enters the mind repeatedly becomes the raw material for thought patterns. If that input is filled with negativity, comparison, or meaningless entertainment, the emotional energy required for ambition gets depleted without awareness. On the other hand, environments that reinforce growth, whether through organized space, focused routines, or people who prioritize progress, naturally elevate a person's internal drive without forcing it. This is why some individuals appear naturally motivated. It is not because they are constantly inspired, but because their environment continuously pulls them toward action. When motivation disappears, the instinct should not only be to look inward, but also to examine what is being consumed outwardly. Even small changes in surroundings, such as cleaning a workspace, limiting digital distractions, or reducing exposure to unproductive influences, can create a shift in mental energy. The mind does not operate in isolation. It reflects the conditions it is repeatedly exposed to, and those conditions silently determine whether action feels heavy or natural throughout the day. Discipline becomes essential precisely at the moment when motivation begins to fade, because motivation is emotional, and emotions are unstable, shifting with circumstances, energy levels, and external pressures. When a person relies only on how they feel to determine what they do, their progress becomes unpredictable, because feelings are never consistent enough to support long-term achievement. One day there may be enthusiasm, clarity, and drive, and the next day there may be doubt, fatigue, or distraction. And if decisions are tied to those emotional fluctuations, then consistency collapses. Discipline, however, introduces a different system of living, one where actions are not negotiated with mood, but are guided by commitment. It is the ability to do what needs to be done regardless of whether it feels rewarding in the moment. D. This shift is not about removing emotion from life, but about preventing emotion from becoming the authority over direction. When discipline begins to take control, a person stops asking, "Do I feel like doing this?" and starts asking, "Is this necessary for the life I want?" That single shift in questioning changes behavior at the root level. Emotional decision-making tends to prioritize comfort, avoidance, and immediate relief, which is why procrastination feels natural when motivation is low. Discipline interrupts that pattern by creating structure that does not depend on approval from the current emotional state. It builds an internal agreement that certain actions are non-negotiable, regardless of energy or mood. Over time, this consistency creates a form of identity stability, where a person begins to trust themselves not because they always feel strong, but because they always act according to principle. This trust becomes powerful because it reduces internal conflict. The mind no longer wastes energy debating whether to act or delay. Instead, it follows a preset standard. Emotional decision-making, when left unchecked, often leads to regret, inconsistency, and broken promises to oneself, while disciplined decision-making builds momentum even in difficult conditions. There will always be days when clarity is missing or enthusiasm is low, but discipline ensures those days do not become turning points in the wrong direction. It transforms effort into routine rather than exception, and through repetition, what once required force begins to feel natural. The real strength of discipline is not in intensity, but in reliability, because progress is rarely built through occasional bursts of inspiration, but through repeated action taken when inspiration is absent, when no external encouragement exists, and when the only reason left to continue is the decision made beforehand to not stop regardless of emotional resistance. Clarity is one of the most underestimated forces behind human action, yet it is often the difference between consistent movement and endless procrastination. When the mind is unclear about what it truly wants, it enters a state of hesitation where every option feels equally uncertain, and in that uncertainty, inaction becomes the default response. A lack of motivation is frequently not a lack of energy, but a lack of definition. When goals are vague, such as, "I want to be successful" or "I want to improve my life," the brain struggles to convert those statements into actionable steps because they do not provide direction. The mind needs precision in order to engage fully. It needs to see something specific enough to respond to. When clarity is absent, mental energy gets consumed by overthinking, because the brain keeps trying to fill in the gaps of what is not clearly defined. This is why people can feel mentally busy yet physically stagnant, constantly thinking about change but never translating thought into movement. However, when clarity is introduced, something powerful happens inside the decision-making process. The goal becomes less of a distant idea and more of a structured path, where the next step is obvious rather than overwhelming. Instead of trying to figure out an entire future at once, clarity reduces focus to the immediate action required, which removes emotional resistance. A clear goal is not just about knowing what you want, it is about understanding why it matters deeply enough that discomfort becomes acceptable in pursuit of it. Emotional connection plays a crucial role here because the brain prioritizes what feels meaningful over what feels abstract. When clarity includes emotional weight, such as a strong personal reason or a vivid picture of the outcome, it creates internal pressure that pushes action forward even in moments of doubt. Without that clarity, procrastination often disguises itself as planning, where a person feels like they are preparing but are actually avoiding execution. Clear direction eliminates unnecessary choices, and fewer choices mean less mental fatigue, which naturally increases the likelihood of action. It also reduces internal conflict because there is no longer a debate between multiple possible directions. Instead, there is a single focused line of movement. In that state, energy is not wasted on deciding what to do, but is fully directed toward doing it. Clarity simplifies complexity, and in that simplicity, hesitation loses its grip because the mind no longer sees action as a confusing burden, but as a straightforward requirement tied directly to a defined purpose that leaves no room for delay or distraction in the present moment. Momentum is one of the most powerful psychological forces in human behavior, yet it is often misunderstood as something that only appears after major progress, when in reality it begins with the smallest possible act of movement. When motivation is low, the mind tends to exaggerate the distance between where a person is and where they want to be, making the journey feel overwhelming and unattainable. This perception creates paralysis, where even simple tasks feel heavy, because the brain is measuring them against an unrealistic expectation of immediate transformation. However, momentum does not require transformation, it only requires initiation. A small win, even something as simple as completing a short task, organizing a single area, or taking one step toward a goal, interrupts the pattern of stagnation and signals to the brain that progress is still possible. This signal is critical because the mind is highly responsive to evidence, and once it sees proof of movement, it begins to adjust its emotional state accordingly. What starts as forced effort gradually becomes easier, not because the task itself changes, but because resistance weakens through repetition. Small wins act as psychological anchors that pull a person out of mental inertia, because each completed action reduces internal doubt and replaces it with a growing sense of capability. This process is not dramatic at first, but it is cumulative, and accumulation is where real change begins. When someone waits for a large breakthrough before feeling motivated, they unknowingly place themselves in a cycle of inactivity, because large breakthroughs are the result of smaller, consistent actions, not their starting point. Momentum builds like a chain reaction. One completed action increases the likelihood of another, and that second action makes the third easier, creating a rhythm that gradually shifts behavior from effort-based to flow-based. At this stage, discipline feels less like resistance and more like continuation, because the mind has already accepted movement as the new normal. Even emotionally, small wins create a shift by reducing feelings of helplessness, replacing them with a sense of control over direction. This sense of control is essential because lack of motivation often stems from feeling disconnected from progress. Once that connection is restored through action, the emotional weight of starting begins to fade. Over time, the accumulation of these small wins reshapes identity, because the brain begins to associate the self not with intention, but with execution. A person no longer sees themselves as someone who struggles to start, but as someone who consistently completes, even in imperfect conditions. And that internal identity shift becomes the foundation upon which larger achievements naturally begin to build, without requiring constant emotional persuasion or external pressure. Identity is the deepest driver of human behavior, far more powerful than temporary emotions, and it determines how a person acts when motivation is absent, because identity operates as an internal reference point for what feels natural or unacceptable to do. When someone relies on mood to guide their actions, their behavior becomes unstable and reactive, shifting with every emotional change. But when NTIT takes control, actions are no longer negotiated in the moment. They are expressions of who the person believes they are becoming. This is why two individuals in the same situation can respond completely differently. One may delay and withdraw when motivation disappears, while the other continues to act despite feeling nothing, because their internal identity does not depend on emotional approval. Identity is built through repetition, not intention. Every time a person acts in alignment with a chosen version of themselves, even in small ways, they reinforce a mental image of that identity. Over time, the brain begins to prioritize consistency with that image over temporary discomfort. This means that behavior eventually becomes less about effort and more about alignment. When identity is weak or unclear, the mind constantly seeks permission to act, which creates hesitation, overthinking, and dependence on external validation. But when identity is strong, decisions become faster because the internal question is no longer, do I feel like doing this, but rather, does this align with who I am? This shift removes emotional debate from decision-making and replaces it with behavioral consistency. Even in moments of low energy or mental fatigue, identity continues to guide action because it is not dependent on current feelings, but on accumulated self-perception. This is why people who repeatedly act like disciplined individuals, even before they fully believe it, eventually begin to think of themselves in that way. The brain adapts to repeated evidence, and identity becomes a reflection of consistent behavior rather than temporary inspiration. This process is subtle but powerful because it transforms discipline from something external into something internal and automatic. Once identity is established, motivation becomes less relevant because actions are no longer waiting for emotional permission. They are simply expressions of a predefined standard. This also explains why relapses into old habits occur when identity has not fully shifted, because behavior that contradicts self-perception feels uncomfortable and eventually gets corrected, either toward growth or regression. Strengthening identity requires deliberate action that aligns with the desired self-image, especially in moments when it feels easiest to give up, because those moments provide the clearest opportunity to either reinforce or weaken the internal narrative of who a person believes they are becoming. In the end, the real battle was never against a lack of motivation, but against the habit of waiting for it. Every moment of hesitation was never a sign that you couldn't move forward, but a test of whether you would move forward without permission from your emotions. Life does not reward those who only feel ready. It transforms those who decide to act while feeling uncertain, tired, or even empty. Because progress was never designed to respond to comfort. It responds to consistency. So when motivation fades again, do not treat it as a stop sign. Treat it as a reminder that something deeper must take over. Action, discipline, clarity, environment, momentum, and identity working together as one force. The version of you that you are trying to become is not waiting in some perfect future moment. It is being built in the decisions you make right now, especially when it feels difficult to make them. Every small step taken without emotional permission becomes evidence that you are no longer controlled by how you feel, but guided by who you choose to become. Carry this truth forward. Your life will not change when motivation arrives. It will change when your standards rise above your moods. And from that moment, even ordinary actions begin to shape an extraordinary direction. Good luck on your journey, and may you find strength in the moments when everything inside you tries to slow you down. Thank you for your time and attention. And if this message resonated with you, stay connected and grow with us. Make sure to follow my channel Mind Wealth Theory, where we continue building the mindset that turns hesitation into action and action into transformation.